What's up, everyone? Welcome to the 11th episode of Super Brain Radio, the first episode of Chapter 3, Endure, which is going to be predicated on how the human changes when it chronically participates in something. Whether it's sport, whether it's a phase of life, whether it's a habit, whether it's a job. You chronically doing something, caring about it, and being involved in it for a large portion of your week is going to invoke some type of adaptation. And Endure is all about that specifically. It's funny, this is actually my third time recording this episode. The first time, it didn't record at all. The second time, when it exported, it just came out as static. And I guess if you're hearing this, then the third time was the charm. Maybe I should take some of my own advice and realize this is a greater assessment for this laptop that I got immediately after college is maybe no longer functioning at its top level anymore, and it needs to be innovated upon. So the reason hormones is in quotes here, guys, is because obviously, there's a massive list of hormones in the human body, and most of the time when people bring them up to me as a proxy for change, they're actually just talking about the ligands, or the things, if you will, associated with one gland, and that's the pituitary gland. So we're kind of going to dive into it today, but as usual, I want to start with this conceptual backbone of how I want you to think about it in your head. So if this is your first time hearing about the pituitary gland, you're lucky because you can start from scratch, and this is a great way to do so. And if you kind of know what it is, but you're not really sure, or maybe something as rudimentary as like, oh, growth hormone comes to mind, it's going to take some reformulating in your head. So I want you to start with the image of a trifold brochure, and it's from Verizon Wireless. The reason it's a trifold brochure is not just because there's 3 sections of the anterior pituitary, but more importantly, a brochure has information on all 3 pamphlets that's relatable to each, but it's categorized almost by responsibility, if you will. And ironically, the pituitary is set up the same. The posterior pituitary and anterior pituitary have a very intimate relationship, and they both kind of involve this like energy, socialization, stress response axis that we'll get into in a little bit. But the reason I chose Verizon Wireless is because hormones are ultimately a plight at great communication. And the goal is to take some information from the anterior pituitary most of the time and translate it via a specific cohort of capillaries in the hypothalamus called the hypophyseal portal. And traveling through there, they're ultimately going to get to their target cells. So you call your best friend in LA, and they're able to pick up the phone and have an awesome conversation with you despite being, over 2,000 miles away. So the goal of a conversation is to have comprehension, understanding, whatever it is, right? Even if it's a joke or maybe it's something very important, the goal is the same. So the version of it biologically is epigenetic change. So when we have a hormone leave a certain area, it's going to use epigenetics to acutely change some cells and how they function, whether it's faster, slower, whatever, what have you. That's going to change. And that happening chronically over time, again, in response to the world around you, is what Endure is more specifically all about. So we're kind of going to start to briefly fill in the pamphlets of the brochure. So with the anterior pituitary, this is like where the heavy artillery is, and the word tropes is what you're going to hear come up. And I don't want it to confuse you. I want you to understand that it's just a encompassing term. The hormone itself is not the only thing that's getting secreted from the pituitary gland. It's also going to release like facilitatory factors, meaning things that promote sensitivity. It's going to release inhibitory factors, things that literally blunt it, and they're ultimately an aim to control how long, how high, and how effective it is in the bloodstream. How high meaning the total amount, whether it's a long, low, and slow secretion, or it's going to be something that's much more spiked and sensitive. There are opportunities for both to be effective. So we have somatropes, which refers to the muscle in Latin, and these are going to be related to growth hormones. We have corticotropes that are going to be released and in response to things, that word cortisol may come to mind. It's very, very indicative of function here, although there's plenty of other players involved. We have thyrotropes, which logically relates to thyroid, and then we have our sex hormone related tropes, gonado and lacto, and these are going to be more related to prolactins and your ability to reproduce. So ultimately, the heavy artillery in the anterior pituitary gland is going to be where the hub for dealing with the world around us really is, and how it gets its name and function all come from what's going on here. When we see and kind of start to mull over what's going on here, energy and socialization is what comes to mind, obviously, but you realize that some of the people here, if you will, employees is what I like to call them, have contraindicating relationships to a degree. You know, growth hormone is something that's going to typically cause restorative change and change in the growth, obviously, where it gets its name sense, which costs some money. Now, we also have corticotropes, which are going to be degrading things, but they tend to release some acute money into the bloodstream, if you will. Money being substrate via glucose or fatty acids. So, sure, we may see some contraindicating roles, meaning cortisols are going to tend to take away where growth hormones are going to tend to add at certain points, but they both have mirrored qualities in the sense that, well, growth hormone needs some, and cortisol may release some. The same goes for why thyroid exists here, and also why we have our sex-related things here for reproduction, because those are certainly going to not be free, and that needs to be balanced out by our energy-releasing and stress-managing factors, and that's why they're going to also be linked to what goes on in the posterior pituitary. We'll talk about the intermediate last, but the posterior pituitary is going to be important in that it has vasopressin and oxytocin. And these are the main ones I want to focus on, and it's because vasopressin is going to be really important in monitoring water and ions, as well as the ability to learn, actually. So this is where the whole rest of the body starts to get linked here. We also have oxytocin primarily, which is not going to be related to making pasta noises with your intimate partner. And in fact, I hate the fact that it's associated with sex, because we actually get a far more accurate and certainly greater release if you travel to a place you've never been before and you have to get in a cab and find your way to the hotel. Oxytocin is for successfully socializing in new scenarios, and it's very important because that is going to be the metaphysical perceptual alteration that helps give information to the anterior pituitary on what and how much needs to be sent out elsewhere. The intermediate is going to be important because this is what we have, and I love how accurately they're named, intermedians. And their job is much more of passing the baton, communication, and there is a primary hormone that exists here called melanocyte stimulating hormone, but ultimately, we'll talk about it later. We're actually, when we get deeper in the double-digit chapters of GSB, things are actually going to be revisited and looked at through a deeper profile, and that's when that type of stuff is going to come into play. But what we need to understand right now, and I'll review it one more time before we move on like, well, what does that mean to me, and can I aim to control this in life? It's that the pituitary gland is going to be a balancing act of how to deal with the world around us chronically over time through this Verizon wireless brochure. If that kind of like run-on sentence makes any sense to you, then you actually have a firmer grasp on what's going on here than you need. And if you want to be specific, just Google it. That's the beauty of it, guys. You know, knowledge and research papers and anything you can kind of want to get your hands on as far as books is really accessible to you. There's no book on concepts and what to learn to get what you want. That's your own plight and decision-making process, but there are certainly books on specific things. So if you can just identify the specific things you want to learn, then things are probably going to go pretty well for you in the acquisition of knowledge. So I want you to immediately recognize that there's like this dual-edged sword going on with the pituitary. especially because the world around us is acutely changing, but the pituitary is a chronic employer, if you will, which means you can chronically make things go in a slightly better or slightly worse, meaning based on your lifestyle and how you decide what those words mean to you, way. So, if you find that you chronically over respond to a certain portion of your day, maybe it's rising in the morning, then you need to look at the fact that what's going on and think like a pituitary gland. So pituitary glands anticipate chronically, and that's why things like growth hormone and cortisol and oxytocin are involved. So that means that there is something in your data analysis portion of the immune system, which we've already covered, is referring back to the brain that something really, really stressful is going on in the morning. Now, it could be something as simple as you always have to wake up early for work and you're not a huge fan of it. And that understanding and thinking like a pituitary gland in and of itself can give you an opportunity to make some change. Not only does acceptance happen to make like a weirdly huge difference in the human mind, but more importantly, this is how you can accurately dose supplements and think about what you need. So if you already realize that you wake up kind of stressed because of this expression of anticipation through the anterior pituitary gland for your morning, it's probably a bad time to add stimulants, and they would probably fit better later in the day if you need to continue to work for long bouts. Or you can switch your supplementation, in this case something like a lion's mane or maybe a St. John's wort, or anything that is going to give you an altered perception in relation to the things that you already have going on. And it's certainly not that St. John's wort or lion's mane are going to alter perception in a recreational manner. It's more that the activation of what those extracts do is going to slightly modulate the perception related to the hormones already in your blood via the brain's mechanisms. So the catch here is that if you kind of want to make chronic change, you should pick something that you could put on cruise control, like your habits. So maybe you want to habitually have better energy through the middle portion of your day. That is going to be an ACTH coming from corticotropes, the anterior pituitary gland functionality. So you should probably do something that invokes a cortisol response midday chronically. I would probably do something random like 10 burpees and pair it with a brain drill or a neuroplastic drill that enhances acuity. That quick drop off in oxygen is going to give you some norepinephrine, some hormones up in the brain, which is going to stimulate that cortisol response. Do that every day at the same time with your neuroplastic drill, and suddenly you can skip that one day, let's say after 3 or 4 weeks of doing it, and you will have the same effect because you've chronically trained this anterior pituitary to do that at that time. And that is how you use the dual-edged sword of the pituitary gland of anticipation and all that in your favor.